My granddaughter's baby shower. My son-in-law's mother stood up in front of 40 people and handed my daughter a laminated card. "A household budget," she announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Every good wife knows her limits." My son-in-law nodded from across the room and said, "Finally, someone said it." My daughter smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. The kind I've seen before on my sister's face. 20 years ago, right before everything fell apart. I didn't smile. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the envelope I'd been carrying for 3 weeks. Then I stood up. My sister Lorraine called me on a Sunday morning in February. I almost didn't pick up. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since her divorce, not since the ugly business of untangling a life that had been systematically handed over to someone else piece by piece. She sounded better than I expected. Clearer. But there was something underneath the clarity, something careful, like a person who's learned to test the ground before every step. "I need to tell you something about Gwen," she said. My daughter Gwen had been married to Marcus for 14 months. They lived in a colonial outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. Nice neighborhood, 2-car garage, a yard Marcus talked about constantly, as if the square footage of the lawn was a personality trait. "What about her?" I asked. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember the first year I was with Derek? How I thought he was just particular, just organized? I remembered. Derek had opinions about everything. How the towels were folded. When Lorraine could visit her friends. Whether she needed a second job. And then whether she needed the first one. It had taken 12 years for all of it to become undeniable. By which point my sister had no savings, no career she recognized, and a name on nothing. "Gwen called me last Thursday," Lorraine said. "She didn't say much, but she asked me something." "What did she ask?" "She asked if I thought it was normal for a husband to have the only credit card." The line went quiet again. "Gerald," Lorraine said, using our father's name the way she always did when she was about to say something serious. "I mean my name. I'm Gerald. 64 years old, retired electrician from Raleigh, bad left knee, good coffee maker. My name is Gerald Hutchins, and I should have seen this coming. I should have seen it when Marcus insisted on a joint account before they were even engaged. I told myself it was practical. I should have seen it when Gwen stopped coming to Sunday dinners alone, always with Marcus in tow, always checking with him before answering basic questions. I told myself it was love, new love. The way people orbit each other in the beginning. I was wrong, and my sister, who had lived the whole arc of this story herself, was telling me I was running out of time. I sat at my kitchen table after we hung up. My wife Eleanor had been gone 6 years. Ovarian cancer, fast and mean. I still talked to her photograph on the shelf above the coffee maker. I looked at it that night and said, "What would you do?" I knew what she would have done. Eleanor was a real estate paralegal for 31 years. She understood property law the way I understood wiring diagrams. She would have already been on the phone with an attorney. She would have already been looking at listings. So that's what I did. I called a real estate attorney named Vivian Chen the following Tuesday. Her office was in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and an insurance broker. But she came with 2 recommendations and a reputation for getting things right the first time. I explained what I wanted. A house, solely in my daughter's name. No co-ownership, no ability for her husband to access it, claim it, or leverage it. A clean title with iron language. Vivian looked at me over her reading glasses. "You understand this could cause friction?" "I understand," I said. "Do it anyway." She pulled out a legal pad. "Tell me why." So I told her about Lorraine. About 12 years of erosion so gradual that nobody saw it happening, including Lorraine herself. About asking permission to visit her own mother. About the joint account that became Derek's account. About the day she finally asked for a divorce and discovered she had no independent credit history, no assets in her own name, and $200 in a checking account Derek technically controlled. Vivian set down her pen when I finished. "I've seen this before," she said. "More than you'd think." "I know," I said. I just didn't see it in time for my sister. I'm trying to see it in time for my daughter. She nodded slowly. We'll make it airtight. I was 64 years old with a pension, a small IRA, and a truck I'd been driving since 2015. I had savings, not a lot, but enough if I was careful. If I stopped being careful about the wrong things. The first thing I sold was the truck. A neighbor's son had been asking about it for 2 years. I called him and named a fair price, and he came over that afternoon with a cashier's check. I watched him drive it down the street, and then I went inside and called a car rental place. Then I liquidated part of the IRA. I paid the early withdrawal penalty without flinching. My financial advisor said, "Gerald, this doesn't make mathematical sense." I said, "I know. Do it anyway." I had a friend who used to run a handyman service, and he needed help with overflow work. I spent 6 weekends fixing gutters and patching drywall in houses that weren't mine, pocketing the cash. My back hurt. My knee hurt more. I didn't stop. I found the house in a neighborhood called Foxcroft, southeast of Charlotte, about 4 miles from where Gwen and Marcus lived. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a small sunroom off the back. The yard was overgrown but manageable. The foundation was solid. I walked through it twice with an inspector named Ray who I'd worked with years ago on a commercial job, and he told me everything I needed to know. I made an offer. It was accepted in 10 days. Vivian drafted the deed. Gwen Marie Hutchins Reeves, sole owner, no exceptions, a clause specifically preventing transfer to a spouse without independent legal counsel and a mandatory 30-day waiting period. Vivian's idea. A good one. I signed the final papers on a Wednesday morning in April, 3 weeks before the baby shower. I drove home in a rental car, stopped at a diner and ordered coffee and eggs, and sat there for a long time just breathing. I had a house key and a deed and an envelope in my coat pocket. My daughter didn't know it existed. The baby shower was held at Marcus's parents' house in Mooresville. A large house, newer construction. The kind with a 3-car garage and a kitchen island the size of a dining table. Judith, Marcus's mother, had planned everything. The decorations, the catering, the seating chart, everything was color-coordinated and monogrammed and slightly too expensive for the occasion, the way things always were when Judith was in charge. I sat in the second row of chairs near the window, next to my sister Lorraine, who had driven down from Virginia. She'd squeezed my arm when she arrived and looked at the envelope in my coat pocket and said nothing. Gwen looked beautiful. 7 months along, tired in the way. Pregnant women are tired, but present, laughing at the right moments. She was wearing a pale green dress I'd never seen before, something Marcus had picked out, she'd mentioned casually on the phone. He had opinions about how she dressed now. I'd filed that away. The first hour passed the way these things do. Games, presents, plates of food nobody touched. Judith circulated through the room like a campaign manager, making sure everyone knew she'd paid for the shrimp. Then, after the gifts were mostly opened, Judith stood up. She was holding a laminated card, the kind you'd use as a placemat at a restaurant, sturdy and sealed. She smiled at the room the way people smile when they believe they're about to be applauded. "For our daughter-in-law," she announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "A little something practical. Every good wife needs to understand the household economy." She presented the card to Gwen with both hands like it was a diploma. A monthly budget breakdown. What to spend, where to save. Marcus helped put this together. 40 people looked at my daughter. The budget was itemized. Groceries, gas, personal expenses, and this one had a number next to it that I will not repeat here except to say it was less than what I spent on coffee in a week. At the bottom, in bold, it said, "All discretionary purchases over $50 require spousal approval." The room was very quiet. Marcus, from across the room, nodded. "Finally," he said. "Someone said it." He smiled. Easy, confident. A man who had no idea that anything was about to change. Gwen looked down at the card. Her jaw was tight. She nodded once, small and controlled, and said, "Thank you, Judith." 2 words, small and controlled, and said, "Thank you, Judith." 2 words, the voice of a woman who had learned to make herself very small. I looked at my sister. Lorraine had her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes were somewhere on the floor. She had worn that same expression for 12 years. I stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I was 64 years old and my knee was hurting and I'd been awake since 5 a.m. And I walked across that room the way I walk across any room, deliberately, like I thought about it. "Gwen," I said, "I have something for you too." Every head in the room turned. I took the envelope out of my coat pocket. I walked to my daughter and I put it in her hands. "Open it," I said. She looked at me. There was something in her eyes I recognized. Not quite hope, something more careful than hope. The look of someone who has learned not to want too much. She opened the envelope. She took out the papers. She read the first line. Her lips moved slightly. "Read it out loud," I said quietly. "It's all right." Her voice when she spoke was unsteady. "Property deed." She stopped. Started again. "Property deed." She stopped. Started again. "Property deed. Owner, Gwen Marie Hutchins Reeves." She looked up. "Dad, keep reading," I said. "Address 4217 Foxcroft Lane, Charlotte, North Carolina." Her voice broke on the last syllable. "Sole owner. No co-title. No." She stopped reading and looked at me and I could see her trying to hold herself together. "Dad, what is this?" "It's yours," I said. "Only yours. No one can take it from you." The room was completely silent. Then Judith said, "Excuse me." Marcus had moved to stand beside his mother. His expression had changed. The easy confidence was gone. Something harder and more calculating had replaced it. "What exactly are you suggesting, Gerald?" "I'm not suggesting anything," I said. "I'm giving my daughter a house." That's when Judith's husband, a quiet man named Earl, who had sat in the back corner all afternoon and not said 3 words, slowly stood up. I had met Earl exactly twice. He was a soft-spoken man, a retired schoolteacher from Concord. He had the kind of stillness that you don't notice until it's interrupted. He walked toward us and the room parted for him slightly. He stopped in front of Gwen. He looked at the deed in her hands. Then he looked at his son. "Marcus," he said, "that budget card your mother made." He paused. "Was that your idea or hers?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "We discussed it." Earl nodded slowly. "I see." He looked at me. His eyes were the kind that had seen a lot and decided not to say most of it. "My daughter," he said, quietly enough that only the people near us could hear, "left her first marriage with nothing. We thought Raymond was a good man. Stable. He provided." He stopped. "She asked him for a divorce the same month she realized she didn't own anything, not even the clothes in the closet. His name, his card, his house." He looked back at his son. I never said a word. I thought it wasn't my place. He set his hand on Gwen's shoulder briefly, gently. "Good for you," he said to me. "I should have done this for my daughter." Judith erupted. "Earl, this is not the time, Judith." His voice was still quiet. "Just quiet in a different way. Please don't." She stopped. I had the impression this was not something that happened often. Marcus turned to Gwen, and his voice had gone low and tight. "We're going to talk about this at home." Gwen looked at him. She held the deed with both hands. She said nothing, but she did not look down. The phone calls started 4 days later. Short ones, then shorter ones, then none at all for 2 weeks. I told myself to wait. I told myself she needed time. I told myself a lot of things. Then Lorraine called me. "She asked her friend Denise not to call anymore," Lorraine said. "Marcus said her outside friendships were interfering with their marriage." I knew that sentence. Word for word, I knew it. I had heard it before in a different voice about my sister. I drove to Charlotte the following Saturday unannounced. Gwen answered the door and she looked like she'd been wearing the same careful expression for a month. She changed her hair, pulled back tight in a way she never wore it before. Her clothes were different, muted, covered. Nothing like her. "Dad," she said, and her eyes moved past me to check the driveway. Marcus's car was gone. "Grocery run," she said. She had maybe 20 minutes. We sat at the kitchen table and I watched my daughter speak in measured sentences, like she was editing herself in real time. She told me she had stopped working. Marcus thought it was better for the baby, better for their schedule. She told me Denise had been causing stress. She said these things in a careful, rehearsed voice that didn't belong to her. I did not argue with any of it. I asked one question. "Are you happy?" She looked at the table. "I'm fine," she said. I drove back to Raleigh, and I called Vivian Chen. "I need the next steps," I said. We met in Vivian's office on a Tuesday afternoon, Gwen and me, while Marcus was at a work lunch. Gwen had told him she had a prenatal appointment. She sat in the chair across from Vivian with her hands in her lap, looking at the property deed Vivian had laid on the desk. Vivian was steady and methodical. She did not dramatize anything. She walked Gwen through what the deed meant, what it protected, what rights Gwen had as sole owner. Then she asked Gwen a series of questions that were not easy to answer. "Does he monitor your location? Does he control the bank accounts? Does he tell you what to wear? Has he ever prevented you from leaving?" Gwen answered yes to everyone. Her voice was flat, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had been practicing not feeling it for over a year. "What you're describing," Vivian said, "is a pattern of coercive control. Under North Carolina law, it's a recognized form of domestic abuse." "He hasn't hit me," Gwen said. "That's not a requirement," Vivian said. "Abuse isn't only physical. Isolation, financial control, monitoring. These are recognized forms of harm. You don't have to wait until it gets worse." Gwen looked at me for a long moment. "I'm pregnant," she said. "I know," I said. "He'll fight for the baby." "Then we'll fight back," I said. "Together, with a lawyer, with documentation, with everything we have." She looked at the deed again, her name on it in black ink. "Solely owner. I want a divorce," she said. Quiet as anything. Quiet like a door finally closing on a room that had been left open too long. We left Vivian's office with paperwork and a plan. Gwen called me when she got home and said Marcus's car was in the driveway. I said I was 15 minutes away and not to go inside without me. I was 11 minutes away when she called back. He'd gone through her bag. He'd gone through her bag. He'd found the folder. I heard his voice through the phone before she could say anything else. "Who gave you these?" And then, upstairs. "Now." I called 911 before I even pulled out of the parking lot. "My daughter is being prevented from leaving." I gave the address. I said she was 7 months pregnant and she was alone with him. I drove. The whole way I was thinking about Lorraine. About the night she called me from a gas station bathroom because she was afraid to be at home. About how I had said, "I'm sure it's not as bad as it seems." About how I had to live with that. Not again. There were 2 patrol cars outside when I arrived. An officer stopped me at the door. "Are you the father?" "Yes." "We're handling it." I said I was going in. They were in the upstairs hallway. Marcus was standing in the doorway to the bedroom. Gwen was behind him. She saw me over his shoulder and her face changed. "She's fine," Marcus said. "This is our home. This is a private matter." The officer, whose badge said Kowalski, looked at Marcus very directly. "Sir, I need you to step back." "She didn't want to call," Marcus said. "She doesn't need to be rescued." "Sir." Kowalski again? Not loud, firm. "Step back now." Marcus, step back. Gwen came forward. She walked past him and down the hallway, and when she reached me she put her head against my chest and I put my arm around her. "I've got you," I said into her hair. "I've got you." I heard Kowalski say Marcus's name. I heard the particular sound of handcuffs. I didn't look back. Gwen gave her statement at the precinct for 2 hours. She told them everything. The accounts, the monitoring app on her phone he'd installed without telling her, the friends he'd spoken to directly and asked to give her space, the budget card, the job she left, the way he'd intercepted 2 phone calls from me by answering her phone and telling me she was resting and would call back. She also told him she was 30 weeks pregnant. The detective who took her statement, a woman named Carver, was thorough and unhurried. When Gwen finished, Carver looked at her notes and said, "We have enough here, more than enough." The courthouse in Charlotte was busy on a Wednesday morning. Vivian stood beside Gwen, and I sat 1 row back. Marcus came in with a lawyer in an expensive suit who looked like he charged by the sentence. Marcus himself looked like a man who had decided that confidence was the same thing as innocence. His attorney argued that Gwen had never been prevented from leaving, that the financial arrangements were mutually agreed upon, that the monitoring software was for safety during pregnancy. He used the word overreaction 4 times. Vivian did not raise her voice once. She presented Detective Carver's report. She presented the phone records. She presented the testimony of Denise, Gwen's former friend, who had agreed to give a statement describing the phone call she'd received from Marcus, asking her to stop putting ideas in Gwen's head. She presented the budget card, laminated and itemized, which she placed on the judge's bench without comment and let speak for itself. "Your Honor," she said, "my client was isolated from her family, her friends, and her income. She was monitored without her knowledge or consent. She was prevented from making financial decisions for herself. She was carrying a child and had no access to independent funds, no credit history in her own name, and no ability to leave without forfeiting everything. This is not a difficult marriage. This is a controlled environment." The judge, a compact woman in her 50s named Judge Holloway, looked over the documents for a long moment before she spoke. She granted the divorce on grounds of domestic abuse and coercive control. The property at 42117 Foxcroft Lane was confirmed as solely Gwen's. Full custody of the child was awarded to Gwen, with supervised visitation pending evaluation. A permanent protective order was issued. The gavel came down. Marcus sat very still. Then he turned and looked at me. I looked back. I didn't say anything. He already knew. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, my granddaughter was born on a Tuesday evening at Atrium Health Carolinas Medical Center. They put her in my arms in the hallway outside Gwen's room while the nurse was doing paperwork, and I stood there under the fluorescent lights holding this small, perfect, absolutely furious child, and I cried. Not quietly. Ugly, unashamed crying, the kind I hadn't done since Eleanor died. Her name is June. She weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and she had her mother's nose and her grandmother Eleanor's hands, and she entered the world owing nothing to anyone. Gwen moved into the Foxcroft house the week after she was discharged. I drove the moving truck. The rain came down from Virginia and brought food and boxes and her whole self, and the 3 of us spent a Saturday moving furniture and hanging curtains and debating where the changing table should go. At some point in the afternoon, Lorraine carried June through the small sunroom off the back of the house while Gwen and I stood in the kitchen drinking bad coffee from a gas station cup. The light was good in that room, the kind of afternoon light that makes things look like they've always been there. Gwen looked at her house. She was quiet for a minute. "I kept thinking," she said, "that if I was better, more patient, quieter, he would stop. That I was the variable." "I know," I said. "Lorraine's call was the first time I thought." She stopped. "I thought if it happened to her, and she's the smartest person I know, then maybe it wasn't about being smart enough. Or good enough." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Maybe it was just him." "It was just him," I said. She nodded. "I know that now." She looked at me. "I didn't know that enough when it was happening. I wish I had. I should have said it sooner," I said. I saw things and I told myself it wasn't my business. It was your business, she said, not angry, just honest. I know, I said. I'm sorry. She leaned her head against my shoulder briefly, the way she used to do when she was 12 and had a bad day at school. Then she straightened up and went to go relieve Lorraine, and I stood in that kitchen for a little while longer alone. 3 months later, Gwen went back to work at the architecture firm where she'd been a project coordinator before Marcus convinced her to leave. Her old manager, a practical woman named Beverly, actually, a woman I'll call Tamara, since I've used other names, called her the week after she'd submitted her resume and said the position she'd vacated had never really been filled to his satisfaction. And what would it take? Gwen told me about it over the phone, and I could hear in her voice the thing I'd been waiting to hear for over a year. Not happiness exactly, not yet. Something earlier than that. The sound of a person who has remembered what they're good at. She arranged childcare with a woman in the neighborhood she'd met at a park. She opened a checking account in her own name and a credit card in her own name, and she set up a savings account for June that no one else could touch. One evening she called me and said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." I said, "Go ahead." "I ran into Earl at the grocery store," she said, "Marcus's father." I waited. He asked how June was. He'd heard from mutual friends. She paused. He said, "Tell your father I should have done what he did about 20 years ago." Another pause. "You looked really tired, Dad, like he's been carrying something heavy for a long time." I thought about that for a while after we hung up. Earl had seen what was coming. He'd recognized it in his own son because he'd watched it somewhere else first, and he hadn't acted. I understood that particular weight. I'd carried my own version of it for years, since Lorraine's divorce, since the phone calls I should have made sooner. We do what we can, then, if we're lucky, we get a second chance to do it better. On a Saturday in late October, I drove to Charlotte and sat in the backyard of the Foxcroft house. The overgrown parts had been cleared. Gwen had planted 2 rose bushes along the fence, which had not bloomed yet but looked like they intended to. June was in a bouncer on the porch, absolutely fascinated by a leaf that had blown near her foot. Lorraine was there. She'd been coming down monthly since the divorce, and something between her and Gwen had settled into a kind of steady, specific friendship. 2 people who had survived similar things at different times, comparing notes without needing to explain themselves. We sat in lawn chairs and drank lemonade and didn't say very much for a while. Then Gwen said, "I want to tell June about all of this someday. Not to make her afraid, just so she knows." "Knows what?" Lorraine asked. Gwen thought about it. That she has options, that she was born into a house that's hers, that no one gave it to her husband, that it exists because someone. She looked at me, because her grandfather sold his truck and cashed in a retirement account and drove a rental car for 4 months so she'd always have somewhere to go. I said, "I'd do it again." Gwen said, "I know. That's what I want her to understand." June, on the porch, had apparently decided the leaf was not worth her further attention and was now staring at the sky with the complete seriousness of a person encountering weather for the first time. I watched my granddaughter. I thought about Eleanor, about how she would have been here already, would have arrived 3 days early and reorganized the kitchen and held the baby for 6 hours straight and made something in a casserole dish that nobody asked for but everyone needed. I thought about the truck I'd sold, the IRA penalty, the 6 weekends of handyman work with a bad knee. I thought about Lorraine in a coffee shop in Virginia, her hands shaking around a cup of tea she never touched, telling me to do for Gwen what nobody had done for her. I thought about the budget card, laminated, itemized, handed to my pregnant daughter in a room full of people as if her limits were a gift. And I thought about what Gwen had said in the kitchen, holding bad coffee. "This house gave me permission to live my life." It wasn't the house. I know that. It was never the square footage or the Foxcroft address or the legal language Vivian drafted so carefully. It was the fact that someone believed she deserved it before she believed it herself. It was the message inside the deed. You have options. You have somewhere to go. You matter enough for someone to sacrifice to protect you. That's the thing nobody tells you about protecting the people you love. It's not a single dramatic moment. It's not showing up at the door with police. It's the months before that, the quiet decision made at the kitchen table at 11 p.m. that nobody else will ever see. The cancelled truck, the penalty fee. The weekends on a bad knee. The years after, those belong to Gwen. She'll spend them as she chooses, working and raising June and rebuilding whatever she decides to rebuild. There's a man in the neighborhood she mentioned twice in passing, a civil engineer with a daughter about June's age, and she said his name with the particular carelessness of someone trying not to make too much of something. I didn't comment. She's 31 years old. She doesn't need my opinions. She needs to know that the house is hers. She knows. And June growing up in those rooms, learning to walk on those floors, eating breakfast in that kitchen. She'll never know anything different. She'll never know what it means to need permission. She'll just grow up knowing she has options. The way a person who has always had clean water doesn't understand thirst. That's all I wanted. That's everything. My name is Gerald Hutchins. I'm 64 years old, and I'm a retired electrician from Raleigh. And the best thing I ever did with my savings was spend it before I was supposed to. If you have a daughter, if you have a son, if you have someone you love who is starting to seem smaller than they used to be, who is editing themselves in your presence, who calls less often and says less when they do, don't wait until it's obvious. Don't tell yourself it's not your business. Don't do what I almost did. Do what Angela told me to do, what Lorraine told me to do, what every woman who ever survived one of these marriages would tell you to do. Act now, while there's still time, while they can still hear you, while the house can still be bought, because freedom isn't free and it isn't guaranteed, and it doesn't arrive on its own. Somebody has to go buy it first. People ask me sometimes if I regret it. The truck, the IRA penalty, the 6 weekends on a bad knee patching drywall in other people's houses. And I don't have a complicated answer. No. I don't regret a single dollar of it, but I do think about cause and effect a lot these days. Not in any mystical way. I'm a retired electrician from Raleigh, not a philosopher, but in the plain, practical way you think about wiring. Every connection matters. Every decision you make or don't make runs current somewhere. Sometimes it lights the room. Sometimes it starts a fire behind the wall where nobody can see it until it's too late. Marcus didn't become who he was overnight. Judith handed her son the blueprint and he followed it, because nobody ever made him face a consequence for it. Earl saw it happening and stayed quiet, because he told himself it wasn't his place. And my daughter, who is one of the sharpest people I know, spent 14 months making herself smaller, because the people who were supposed to say something didn't say it soon enough. That's the thing that keeps me up sometimes. Not guilt, exactly. More like a clear-eyed accounting. My sister Lorraine called me because she had lived the whole story and recognized the opening chapters in Gwen's life. She did the courageous thing. She made the call I should have made years earlier for her. And because she did, I had time to act. Just barely, but enough. Intelligence alone didn't save Gwen. She's smart. She was smart the whole time. Smart people end up in these situations constantly. Because intelligence doesn't protect you from someone who is methodically, patiently dismantling your sense of what's normal. What protected Gwen was someone paying attention, someone willing to be inconvenient, to spend money they weren't supposed to spend yet, to show up unannounced, to make a phone call at 11 p.m. That's not brilliance, that's just stubbornness in the right direction. And the moral part, the part I want June to understand someday when she's old enough, is that decency is not passive. It doesn't just mean not doing harm. It means doing something when you see harm being done, even when it's awkward, even when someone might tell you it's not your business. Earl knew. He watched his own daughter go through it, watched the same pattern repeat in his son, and stayed in his chair. He's a decent man in most ways, but decency that stays seated isn't enough. Gwen is back at work now, She has a house and a checking account and a credit card and a daughter named June who will grow up knowing that her options are not negotiable, that nobody gets to laminate her limits and hand them to her in front of a room full of people and call it a gift. I think about Eleanor. I think about how she would have done all of this faster and better than me and arrived 3 days early with a casserole. I think about the truck I sold and the ache in my knee and the rental car. And I think, yeah, worth it. Every single bit of it. Worth it. If you're reading this and you recognize something in Gwen's story, in the way she edited herself, in the phone calls that got shorter, in the careful smile that didn't reach her eyes, don't wait for it to become obvious. By the time it's obvious, someone has already lost something they won't easily get back. Act now. Say the thing. Make the call. Be inconvenient if you have to. That's all this is in the end. Someone deciding that another person's freedom is worth the trouble of fighting for it.